Here we are. This is the third presentation of our draft budget for 2019. Just to remind our community, these were the issues that have been impacting our budget all along. The Act 1 index is 0.56. We've seen an increase in PSERS contribution levels, and we're getting close to that top. We talked about that the other day. Our debt service is going up about $500,000 next year. We saw about a $200,000 increase in charter school tuition. Most of that was for cyber school, and I did share with the board some particular issues about charter schools and cyber schools in particular. The board has set a few priorities for the administration to look at school counseling services, how we can address mental health issues around the district. Our state and federal funding levels we think will be a hold harmless. We don't think they'll go down, but we don't know how much of an increase. And if they do go up, it'll be very minimal. Next year we'll experience a significantly larger increase in the number of sabbaticals, but that will quickly go back down to historic rates the following year. We only had 4 retirements. So that is one area we always look at when a teacher leaves as to whether we replace them or not, but unfortunately this year we only had 4 retirements. And certainly the board is aware of their contractual obligations with the labor groups that we negotiate with. So all those issues combined certainly have a significant impact on the board's decision about the budget. Since last time we told you we were going to look more closely at our revenues and expenditures. We looked at everything from EIT to reimbursements, and from expenditures we did have our first round of staffing. Dr. Davis and Dr. Irvin had their staffing meetings at the beginning or sometime during last week, and we think we're going to be about a hold harmless with staffing, even though we're projecting about 50 more kids district-wide. We think that we'll be able to absorb those into our current staffing levels. But we're always watching. We'll be watching throughout the summer to look at any influx in some of our elementaries or at any level. We'll be watching those very carefully. So staffing, we think we're about a hold harmless for our budget. We've looked at utility costs. We think we can capture some cost savings there. As you know, most of our buildings have been renovated, and really this high school was renovated and is saving. Our expenditures on utilities are much lower than what we had anticipated or what we had seen in the past. So we're very happy with the construction and the controls we have in place at this building. Looked at our supply budget and also looked at some contracted services. We also discussed with the board that we asked you to consider using, we have been using about $750,000 from our fund balance, and we asked the board to consider an increase up to $1 million because of some of those one-time increases that I mentioned earlier. And it seemed to me that the board was in agreement with this, using that. And Mr. Reamer, I'll ask at the end of my presentation just to confirm that everybody is good using that $1 million. So here's where we are today. You can see revenues, expenditures. We're out of balance by $2.3 million. If the board uses $1 million in fund balance, that leaves our net out of balance 1.357. This includes increasing our elementary counseling staff from 3.5 to 5.6. And we talked about what would a benefit that we thought that would have on our school program, school counseling program. Rob, where were we going to talk about the Moody's rating? In the one before?
Sure. Yeah, we can talk about that in regards to fund balance. So every spring, we do a call with Moody's, and they analyze our financial statements and look through our CAFR and our audit, and they benchmark us against other school districts in the state and nationwide. We, for the last few years, were AA1 rated by Moody's. It's the second highest bond rating you can get across the in their rating scale. AA3, which is 2 tiers below us, that's the median for across the country. And locally here, we are the highest anyone that touches us, and even some people across the river, such as Fox Chapel. They're AA2 rated. So they take into a lot of considerations, our budget, our willingness to raise taxes, the economy, our tax base, and any debt and pension obligations we have. So we're real happy with that. They do mention in the comments section about the overall fixed costs, and I know we talked about this a lot in budget. 89% of our budget's essentially completed before we even get started because of staffing and debt service. So fixed costs, charter schools, debt service, and pension reform, they're affecting every school district. It's not just us. So,
Rob, is there some discussion in that report about the appropriateness of our fund balance and making sure that they feel it's a healthy percentage?
That is part of the rating, and it does mention our fund balance and our savings being stronger than other school districts of our size.
And they want it at 6%?
So our policy calls for 6%. Their standards and the GFOA standards are actually a lot higher than that. They actually call for 2 months of bills, which here is about $17 million. So, but they're very comfortable with our threshold. And what they look at is it not dipping below that. So with our policy to set it at 6% of next year's budget every year, it turns up that couple percent every year, and they like to see that consistency.
Just to clarify, that is based on what we set as the policy, not
Correct.
what we actually have.
Correct.
Okay.
We have more than that, but that's what we set it as unassigned with our policy. Correct.
No, the bond rating, the AA1 bond rating is what helped us when we refinanced the big high school bond several years ago, correct?
That's correct. So that's key for our financing, and that keeps our debt payments down.
And for how long is the rating good for?
They do a revision every year. Anytime they change your rating, they usually, which ours hasn't changed, but it takes 2 years for that change to take effect. But we're going to stay, which they call no outlook, and stay AA1.
Nice work.
That's all my predecessor. I'm just reporting the good news.
Smart comment.
So what the hell?
So I did mention the elementary counseling proposal. We're real excited about that because that will mean if we move to 5.6 counselors, I know that fraction is a funny number, but that'll mean we'll have the same counselor in the same building 5 days a week. It'll be a little bit more at some of our bigger schools and a little bit less in some of our smaller schools, but we know that the research suggests that the earlier you can address mental health and challenges that children are facing, the less likely in the long run you'll see problems as the kids go on. So I commend the board for really identifying that as something that they wanted to see happen. So here's where we are now. So we remain out of balance 1.357 million or 0.50 mils. And the index again is 0.56, so the board is down below that index. That millage equivalent is $50 per $100,000 of assessed value on your house. Our process from here, given the board's green light with the $1 million, is to continue to refine expenditures, consider some revenue, potential for revenue increases. The more data we have from this year, the better we can guess about next year. And we'll have another month under our belt, and we'll be able to refine it even closer. So we will be asking you next week on April 15th to approve a proposed final budget. And we are required by that timeline, Act 1 timeline, to post it for 30 days for public comment and review, and then in May you would take action on a final budget. And it doesn't mean on April 15th we're locked in stone. That means if we find out we're going to get more in revenues or we find a specific significant cost savings, we can even get the millage down between April 15th and May 20th, whenever the board has to take final action on it. So I guess, Mr. Reamer, I'm asking, is the board comfortable using that $1 million? And are they comfortable with the direction that we're moving right now?
I'd like to go around the table, and Mrs. Capucci, start with you, please.
Sure.
Excuse me. Yes, Dr. Steinhauer, I am comfortable with both things that you just discussed, the direction you're taking and the fund balance. I would like to say, normally we might not be comfortable with using that much fund balance, but we do have some anomalies this year, especially the sabbaticals. So given that they are one-time events, it seems appropriate. And I'd also like to thank you and Mr. Galecko for meeting with all the board members and Mr. Galecko for sharing his plan and his vision for the district's finances in the next 5 years. It was good to see it, and it will keep us moving in a direction even if we aren't exactly where that plan is. So thank you.
Dr. Straubmeyer.
I agree. And I think one of the things to highlight is looking at the forecasting over the next several years. Mr. Galecko and Dr. Steinhauer have kind of put together in those meetings with us, kind of gives us that confidence that this is that year where we're doing a few extra things, particularly with the school counselors, listening to the community, particularly the parents at the elementary level that have sent in emails, that have talked to us one-on-one. Asking for that support. That this is while it's a one-time hire, it's happening in a year where we also have very few retirements. We have some extra sabbaticals that going to that extra $250,000 that we haven't done before, and seeing that we're still maintaining probably that bond rating, so that when we're ready to have that next set of bonds come up in a few years, I feel comfortable with how Mr. Galecko has kind of mapped that out, and in discussions with everybody else on the board. I think. From what I've heard, we're all on the same page.
Mr. Beal.
First, I'd like to thank Mr. Galecko for meeting with me. I appreciate very much his time. He also produced this fund balance projection sheet for the year ending June 30th. And just a couple points I'd like to make. First, I fully support the additional counselors at the elementary schools. I think it is very wise, and I think it's something we can easily afford. I noticed that we are able to supplement our unassigned fund balance to get to that 6% or $6,300,000. I asked Mr. Galecko to kind of project the capital fund as well. He feels that as of the end of June, as of the end of this year, we'll have just over $3.5 million in the capital fund. And if you subtract out approximately $1.1 million in capital spending in addition to the books and technology, that totals about $1.1 million. That'll drop that to about $2.4 million, which is approximately 2 years worth
of capital improvements.
If you take a look at our general fund, you look at our two components of our general fund, excluding the $1 million that I support using for this next year's budget. We have a capital projects fund, which actually resides in the general fund of just under $4 million, and a post-retirement fund of $2.675 million. And it is my thought, given that we have a large unassigned fund balance and a ample capital fund and ample general fund in case that we can use to supplement our capital fund, that we should take a look at the OPEB, the post-retirement fund. That money has been sitting there for a generation. It has been sitting there through economic crisis and state shutdowns and the construction of the high school, and through just about every imaginable a pension meltdown. Despite all that, we've never had to touch that, and I think we should consider using a portion of that to do what it's supposed to do, which is to fund post-retirement. Again, there's 5 years worth of spend in there, so I would suggest using one of those 5 years. I would access that fund. Thank you.
Quick question, just with Mr. Gregg. Could you explain to people sitting here what OPEB is and how it works?
So it's called Other Post-Employment Benefits. When employees separate service here, depending on what contract they're in, they're afforded health care and some other retirement benefits until they hit Medicare eligibility. Some people could be on our health insurance plan for 7 years, some can be on for 2. So that money is there essentially as an accounting number. So if we closed our doors tomorrow, we were able to fund people's retirement benefits as they were contractually obligated.
And does that factor into our Moody's rating as well?
Certainly, they look at our overall fund balance, yes.
Thank you. Thank you also for the meeting. Mr. Galetko and Dr. Steinhauer was very helpful as always. My comments will be brief. I fully support the $1 million use of the fund balance. I'm very comfortable with where we are. I thought Mr. Beal's analysis was excellent, summarizing the various components. We're doing the right thing for the kids by adding the counselors, and thankfully, we can afford it. So I'm very supportive of this. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Frioni.
Question, Mr. Galetko. So this year, again, as noted by Mrs. Capucci, is sort of a little bit of an anomaly in that we only have 4 retirements as opposed to maybe the usual 8 to 10, sometimes 12. That we have a substantially or significant amount that we're spending on education for our staff. That's a little bit higher than normal this year. We're not moving any money into capital this year because we kind of have a sufficient amount in capital for the moment. But nevertheless, we usually do move something over to capital that we're not moving this year.
We will. We'll be coming back to the board and asking you to make a transfer.
Okay.
And that's typically the overage from the current year.
Yeah, we usually come back September, October with what our audited results end up being, and we'll ask you to move that.
Okay.
Actually, November, since the audit comes out in November.
If this were a more normal year, and we were still using $750,000 that we normally use of the fund balance, how much more would we have to potentially reduce millage by this year? I mean, it would be another $500,000 or something, another $500,000.
As far as what the sabbaticals cost, or what?
Sabbaticals and the fact we don't have as many retirements. I mean this. I don't expect you to pull out a perfect number. I mean,
yeah, I think $500,000 is a comfortable number to say that without those 2 instances, that's where we'd be at.
And I asked that question because I do support Mr. Beal's statement to a degree. I think that this is a year which we're a little bit more constrained with some odd expenses that we normally don't have. I think we're approaching a millage rate of close to 25 mills, and I would like to explore that idea of, I normally would not like to actually contribute more from fund balances or pulling from OPEB or whatever else like that, but we have another week and actually another month to take a look at that and to explore that a little bit. And I would certainly not, I agree with Mr. Beal, I might look at 1 year, maybe even less than 1 year. I wouldn't look at anything more than that because I understand that the bond rating is based upon that. But I do think it's worth a look.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Diamond.
Well, thank you very much to Dr. Steinhauer and Mr. Galetko for meeting with me as well to discuss this year's budget. I fully support the $1 million, and I believe that there are so many positive outcomes that can be gleaned from bolstering and addressing mental health concerns in our youngest children, early intervention works. It's much easier to correct going down the wrong path when somebody is 8 or 9 years old than when they are in 10th grade and 11th grade, ready to spring into adulthood. And again, agreeing with Mrs. Capucci straight up that this is a year that is odd. There's nothing. We had an inordinate, a lower number of retirements and a greater number of sabbaticals that I'm sure if we took out the exact figure, might be worth $250,000 at least. So I think that's important to consider. Thanks.
Mr. Cooper.
I support the use of the $1 million. When we talked, I'm interested in what Mr. Beal said. Do you have any comments on using the OPEB money?
It wouldn't be my recommendation to go higher than $1 million because next year we would have to start out our budget process being $1 million light in revenue, and I don't feel comfortable going any farther than that.
So as far as the OPEB money, you would say?
I would say no, correct.
No, don't take any money out of there. Okay. So it's your opinion that that would be a negative?
Yeah, and I think if you talk to any business manager, we would not recommend using any fund balance at all. So
Yeah.
$1 million is a stretch in my mind.
Okay. All right, I'm not going to repeat what everybody else said. Obviously, I support the addition of counselors. I think we all received more emails about that than I have in the last 7 years. So obviously, the community is very much in favor of that. And it certainly will be beneficial to the students and help in the long run. So I support the use of the $1 million.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper. Mrs. Olber?
Probably a little over a year ago, this board made a commitment to mental health. We made it a goal for Dr. Steinhauer, and this is just part of that commitment, increasing the guidance counselors in the elementary. And I think it's vitally important for our community to do this, and for our kids. So I definitely support the $1 million from the fund balance to help balance our budget. I do have concerns about using any OPEB funds. I have Mrs. Klein stuck in my head, and I can hear her saying, what Mr. Glecko just said, no, 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 no. That is the money should something happen and we have 40 teachers retire 1 year. That is the money that will go to pay for their benefits that they have earned by teaching in our district. And I don't want to risk that. We rely on our teachers for so much. They are such a vital part of our community that I would be very, very hesitant to touch anything with OPEB, with the principal of OPEB.
Thank you.
Mr. Reamer, can I just say, I have to agree, and I hope that since it's been brought up by several board members, that you would again take a feel for the board on whether we'd like to give any direction regarding the use of OPEB funds.
What do we have as far as?
Well, you have to chime in on your use of $1 million.
Okay.
And
I'm in concurrence with a lot of the things here. I do agree with the $1 million use, and also this was an anomaly this year because of this is, I think, in my time on the board, the lowest number of retirements I've ever seen.
Yep.
And we've also had the highest number of sabbaticals. PISA should be starting to at least top off or start coming down a smidgen. And then the cyber and charter schools, which has always been a pain to me in a school district of this caliber. That's when you add just the cyber school and charter school with the PISAs, that is one substantial chunk out of our budget. So that's just something there. My thought on OPEB, I partially agree with the part of not taking anything out of the capital, but I was wondering if we could not look at something, maybe what would a year's worth of interest from OPEB be without touching principal?
And I think we looked at it about $50,000 is about an interest in OPEB.
Well,
depending on what the market rates are.
I mean, I know we also have something, a little piece coming up with the rebond financing in a few years. It's not going to be huge like it was the last couple ones, but it's going to be something. And I do know that eventually the teachers are going to retire, and when they choose to do so, that those will be savings to the school district. So, again, this is an event horizon right now that's been kind of an anomaly for my 6 years on the board here. And I know Mr. Lebowitz, Mrs. Capucci, you've been on a lot longer too, and I don't know if you can even recall that few of people have retired or not. But,
I don't remember,
Yeah.
honestly.
I don't either. But I also don't, I don't know if you're asking this now, but I think that I like the way that Mr. Beal is approaching it, but I feel like that is a bit too far for us to be touching our OPEB money. I think $1 million is the maximum that I'm feeling comfortable, regardless of where it comes from. So I don't think, I'm not ready to do that.
Yeah, as a follow-up, as we're talking about the retirements this year, it's an exceedingly low number relative to previous years. We don't necessarily know that number doesn't go up by a factor of 3 or 4 next year. That concerns me about potentially dipping into that source of funds right away. Because if we come back and we have 16 retirements next year and we have that separation from the district and need to start using those funds, that concerns me.
I think it's important to remember, however, that we finance our post-retirement benefit out of our operational budget. And if there was a sharp increase in retirements, there would be a drop in our costs. We save money when folks retire. So I think that could be financed. Those savings could be used to finance the operational budget, which funds the OPEB obligation. And I mean, it's just, under what circumstances would we ever touch it? It's not like, I think I understand Ms. Klein's concept that, it's an obligation, and if you're a corporate entity or another entity, that you could potentially close your doors and need that money to finance that obligation. That I can't envision the circumstances under which that would occur here. So,
The most depressing thing that could occur is that next year, if we use more than $1 million from fund balance, OPEB, wherever it comes from, is that next year we either need to use that amount again or raise taxes even more for that amount. So it puts us in a little bit of a hole for the next year. So I would not be, again, in favor of using the OPEB.
I completely agree with that. There's also several years ago when the state did not have a budget, and we had districts all around us who had to borrow money to pay their teachers. That could happen again, and we could be in trouble. And this is money that is put aside to pay the benefits of teachers that they have earned. And I can't go along with that.
I think if there was some shutdown in funding from the state, that is exactly the purpose for which our unassigned fund balance could be utilized.
But that would be to pay current teacher salary.
And we also have $4 million in our fund, in our general fund, to address that obligation. I think that if we don't, I mean, again, under what circumstance would we ever use the money? If we haven't touched it under the horrible things that have unfolded in the last 15 years, again, and the construction of the high school, and I just don't understand why we don't use it to pay a one-time cost.
Mr. Bill, and this is an indirect response, so we typically underspend or over-receive our budget a little bit less than 1%, right around 1%, which is a pretty good track record. And if for some instance the realty transfer taxes came off, $500,000, and earned income was off by another $250,000, then I could foresee a time when we would use that OPEB to cover those OPEB costs. Now, it's about $400,000 or $500,000, and we typically spend it out of underspending, but if we're close, we're not going to have that luxury of using it out of the operating, paying for it out of the operating expense. We haven't been there. You're absolutely right.
In essence, we shouldn't be dipping into our savings to pay our annual operating
Well,
costs.
as Jane always said, it's an operating expense. What people have to remember, we start $1 million in the hole next year. So when Rob goes to put the budget together, we're $1 million that we have to come up with right away. And that could be covered by retirements, that could be covered by cutting programs or whatever. But that we do start $1 million down next year. We haven't had a problem with 750. We've been able to make it happen. I think, Mr. Beal's observations are exactly right. We've been able to do it. Could we do it again? I think, but we can't make you that promise.
Dr. Dunn, what's your thoughts on the OPEB?
I would not dip into the, what is it, 2.8 million?
2.6.
2.6 million. I think it needs to be held steady, as Ms. Ulbrich said. This is what our teachers expect, and they deserve it. They've worked for that benefit. I agree with her statement. Is that what you're talking about, going into the 2.6,
Right.
not
Using
dealing with?
additional amount of money to offset millage increase.
Talking about using money set aside to fund that obligation,
So dipping into that, no.
So the idea, Hugh, is use additional money, let's say $1 million from the fund balance plus another $500,000 from the OPEB, so that the resultant millage increase is that much less.
Yeah, and we don't, if folks
So
aren't.
then we have to find $1.5 million in the budget next year.
I'm not agreeing with it. I'm
Yeah,
asking.
no, I know. I'm just clarifying that.
That's the
that
idea.
sets us in
That's
the
the
hole,
idea, Hugh, right? To
1.5
try to decrease the millage by increasing the fund, the amount from the two, but not one fund balances. That's the idea.
I would believe so. And, if folks are uncomfortable going $500,000, which is only 15% of the balance, which is set aside to pay this obligation, it's important to remember, too, that it is just one component of the general fund. The general fund has $4 million over and above the $1 million we're pulling out, above and beyond the OPEB money. So,
Mr. President, if I may.
Yes, Mr. Freeland.
I do agree with Mr. Beal. We're talking about a potential, even if we anticipate that we will continue to have, we've been fortunate, we continue to have our $750,000 fund balance that we've used for the last 10 years. It's always been there through prudent financing, agreed. And likely to have at least another $500,000 next year through either retirements or less in sabbaticals, which would bring us to $1.25 million, which with the $1 million that we've already taken from the existing fund balance and $250,000 from OPEB, should not be too far of a stretch. And I do politely disagree that although that money is set aside, as Mr. Beal indicated, those expenditures for those teachers, for their benefits, do come from the regular budget. It's only if we were to fall short or cease operations are those reserves touched to, and again, those are, we're talking about $500,000 to $600,000 per year to meet those obligations, and the fact that there's $2.8 million there, it's not like we're exhausting that fund or depleting that fund to a significant amount. I do not see reaching into the OPEB fund for $250,000 to be an extreme risk. I understand Mr. Galetko's and before that Mrs. Klein and reluctance to do that. However, that money has been sitting there for quite some time, and this year is a little bit of an odd year.
Yes, this year is an odd year, which is why instead of $750,000, we're taking $250,000 more, and we're taking $1 million. I always like to try to, as Mr. Glecko does and Ms. Klein always did, think several years out, because we have to be able to think long-term as well. And as Mr. Beal mentioned, we have $3.4 million in our capital projects budget, and we spend about 1.1 between Mr. Marciniak's jobs in the district and our textbooks. How is that going to get refunded? Where is that money going to come from? If we keep taking money out of these other funds, we still have to make the money up the following year. And then the following year after that, if we take $1 million next year, it compounds. And then where does the capital projects money come from? Where does, eventually replacing the stadium turf come from? Where is this money going to come from? We have to think long term. And sometimes that means it's a rough year. And Dr. Steinhauer does a fantastic job about bringing us down as far as he can. And I think we need to trust Mr. Glecko and trust Dr. Steinhauer, and if they say that this is the way to go, then that's what we should be doing, because they are looking long-term. They're looking for the long-term health of the district overall. It's not just this year. It's the next 5 years. It's the next 10 years. And how are we going to continue this wonderful education that we've created?
Okay, we have currently, everyone here, my point was on the OPEB is to spend 1 year's interest, period, and that's all. There's 3 that say something with OPEB and 6 that say no, so I think it's spoken. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll come back. I'll give the board some information on Thursday about how far we get with reducing that millage, and then the board will have to vote on the preliminary budget. We will put it up for public review, and then the board will take the final vote in May. So thank you very much.
Thank you.